really such a pleasure I was feeling the same pleasure waiting for you to start speaking. But now let me just state it that such a pleasure to introduce Anup Dhar, and his presentation is called The Spirit of Marx. The Real of Marx. And Anup is somebody who has been, like himself said, part of the political theology discussions and other discussion forums that across these spaces we are having over time for the last 2-3 years. And personally, I always, every time Anup makes a presentation, it really adds to both what I know but also what I need to know in terms of new possibilities of thinking both politically but also thinking philosophically. So today is another opportunity for doing that. So Anup,
this paper is titled The Real of Marx, and it is something actually I wanted to share in JNU. Really, and when Babu said, okay, go ahead, I initially said I'll do theory of the subject. But then this is the one I wanted to do, and it was very kind of Babu actually to say, okay, try to do that. This paper, and it now has a little bit of a shadow of Shomada's talk in the morning, the 0 to 1. And I remain, of course, troubled by square root of -1. And that is more of my problem. But 0 to 1 also in that sense. And let us see where we reach, if I can manage to make some connection. This paper is a play on the Mobius, The Real of Marx, that is the work of what I'll come to, the Latinian real in Marx, and the real Marx, the really real Marx. It could have also been put in this way, the other of Marx or Marx's other, which would also gesture to the other Marx, the other Marx within the Marx we generally tend to know. And this other, which in a way could be called the other without, is for me today, in today's discussion, for want of a better phrase, non-West. For me, the non-West. And how the non-West has featured in late Marx, not in early Marx, not in Marx writing on British India. That's the Marx kind of I'm staying away from. In fact, that's the Marx stays away from late in life. As also how the non-West had inaugurated the question of non-capital, not necessarily pre-capital, and this is a distinction I'll work on, and what could be called non-capitalist labor practices that do not feature, and this is where the first point comes, labor practices that do not feature in chapter 52, titled Classes in Capital Volume 3. And it's important that Marx reaches class only in Volume 3, and that too in the last chapter of Volume 3, though our general understanding would be that it must have begun with class. Bizarrely, it begins with commodity, reaches class at the end. But which also brings Marx's work and reflection on classes, or what he calls, and this is very important for me, what makes classes rather than what are classes. As he asks in the chapter, and it comes to a seeming halt. The manuscript breaks off at this point, and at which point? It is interesting to note that the manuscript of Capital breaks off the moment Marx engages with the theorization of class or classes, though the general idiom would be that he knew what were classes and he was working thereafter on Capital. And is class then, and this is the question I'll explore all through, the real of capital? And this real is the Lacanian real, to which the question of the void would get connected, and the connection between Lacan and Badiou. And I'm hesitating to speak on Badiou in front of Shomoda, but it's okay, I think. Let us have a discussion on that. So in that sense, the real of capital. Does capital, the book, not capital as the book capital discusses, so there are two capitals over here. Does capital, the book, hit the inassimilable real once one hits the question of class? And the inassimilable real over here, I'll come to that, is non-wage labor. When there is no wage, is there labor? Is there surplus? Is there surplus labor? Or will surplus be always thought through value, surplus value? And that becomes a question. In fact, it becomes a contemporary question for us in India. And this is the doubt, is non-West qua non-capital the inassimilable real in the Marxian scheme? So there are two moments over here. Marx hitting class as the inassimilable real in Capital, Volume 3, Chapter 52, and then late Marx actually coming face to face with the Russian work on capital, which is not a Marxist work on capital in Russia. It's very different. Okay. The Russian work on capital, the Russian work on labor, the Russian work on what they wanted to understand as the working class, etc., etc. In other words, what I'm trying to get at, and it's something I'll come to, is that reading Marx through Lenin, the three sources and component parts of Marxism, Britain, France, and Germany, and reading Marx through Russia, which is largely Asia, would give us an other Marx. So there will be a little trouble over there with respect to what would become of Marx. And where are these inassimilables? Is it the non-West and non-capital that is taking Marx, what I'm calling Russian, the Russian, but Russia is Asia, and in that sense, that Marx arriving and moving beyond the merely objective historical trend. So when Satya says Schelling and Kierkegaard are deconstructive in their relation with history, is there such a moment in Marx as well? Beyond the merely objective historical trend, nowadays called historical materialism? Or is it class that is inaugurating a principal break with the way things are? Marx as if comes to face, quote, a moment of pure surprise. There is as if a crisis in his theory of some kind to which he as such cannot react, something he cannot easily represent. And I'll come to the problem of representation and thinking class beyond representationalist theories. What is it to think class beyond representation, beyond identity? Then where will we reach? Thinking class beyond the noun form, which is the usual understanding of class, working class, as the noun form. It looks like it comes at least twice in Marx. First with and through the question of class, then with and through the question of non-West and non-capital, or is it the encounter with the question of class and non-West? What I would like to argue an encounter with the real, not the really real, not the real world in that sense, and it will also make us rethink what is the world, the void of the real in Lacan and later in Badiou, that makes class to the question of non-capital, including post-capitalist futurities. So, what is a future beyond capital? Is there a future? Non-capital as real, but not as the inassimilable real, but the foreclosed real. And this is why we need a little discussion on the two meanings of the real in Lacan, the real as inassimilable and the real as foreclosed. I'll come to that. I'm just prefacing the entire thing. This hence will take me to the two meanings of the real in Lacan, inassimilable and foreclosed, and what is the difference between the two, why do we need to distinguish between the two. And I think it's Badiou actually who makes this distinction rather sharply and brings something into the reading of the Lacanian real that is again usual when we read the real especially Zizek actually. The chapter on class, hence, is not just an encounter with the other question, and late Marx does not just face the other question in the non-West. The other question is the ground for an encounter with the real question, or the question of the real, non-capital, and the two histories of non-capital. And this I'll develop. What I'm calling the two histories of non-capital in Marx, as against what Divesh Chakraborty calls the two histories of capital. So, what is it to write the two histories of non-capital rather than the two histories of capital? And the clue to the two histories of non-capital are these: one, the Orientalist history, seeing the non qua non of capital as pre-capital, and this is how we look at ourselves. We look at ourselves as a third world, a pre-capitalist relic, and this is how we look at the others within, say, an Adivasi space as pre-capitalist. And a late Marxian way of looking at non-capital as a difficult ground for post-capital. So, in that sense, what could be the two histories of non-capital as also the subject of non-capital. This will take me actually to the very last section where I'll, in a more direct way, come to the question of void, which is the relation between the world and the subject. How to think the world, how to think the subject. Is there a relationship between how I think the world and how I think the subject? What I end up with in terms of that. The clue for the time being is that thinking the world in terms of pre-capital offers one way to think the subject. Thinking the world not in terms of pre-capital offers another way to think the subject. And that may actually make us rethink our description of ourselves. This is a very long introduction. I've taken up 10 minutes to set it up. But now the paper goes through a few steps. I cannot read out the entire paper. The first step, and now I'll speak largely, the first step looks at, and it's quite crazy that why do we go there from Marx? It looks at building on a dialogue, an exchange of letters that happened between 1963 and 1969 between Althusser and Lacan. And a number of letters the two exchanged. It is an exchange that looks at many things, but one primary modality on which the debate happens between the two, not in a direct manner, but this is how I read it, at what I would call possible post-Freudian readings of the case of the Wolfman. The Wolfman, the case of the Wolfman is a case written by Freud, but very interestingly, Wolfman remained in psychoanalytic sessions all his life. So sometimes in my PhD class, I would say the history of Wolfman is the history of psychoanalysis. Wolfman remains in therapy all his life for nearly 50 years with different analysts. And this case has been looked at by Freud, it has been looked at by Lacan, it has been looked at by Abraham Torok, two Hungarian psychoanalysts, and Derrida, who wrote on it, and of course Deleuze and Guattari in 1,000 Platos and partially anti-because they look at the Wolfman case. What is so important about the Wolfman case that this case is being revisited again and again, and why do we do that? Quickly put, it is this, and this, the shadow of this case forms the context of the exchange between Althusser and Lacan, and these two trying to talk about something. I'll come to that. And here, the primary debate that is happening is premised on a 1915 paper by Freud called The Unconscious. And in this paper, the distinction Freud makes between neurosis and psychosis. And to put it simply, it's like this. In Freud's understanding, neurosis is representational. Neurosis is when a global comparison can be made between a sock and a vagina, between a scar and castration. So you make this kind of a comparison, and you try to see what is happening in a dream or in a fantasy as a representation of something that has happened in the past. So in the Wolfman's dream, Wolfman had the dream of white wolves, 5, 6 or 7, and he remained undecided on it even today. And they were white. And Freud always felt that the Wolfman is a representation, the Wolfman's dream, the dream of the wolf, is a representation of the father. And he had been severely criticized by Deleuze and Guattari for this, that why do animals always have to be representatives of infants' paternal or maternal worlds, and why do we always have to think of it as a representation? It's a representation of something. Why do you always have to think like this? And this opened up critiques of the representationalist thinking, and Freud had read Wolfman largely through representationalist theories. So the wolf was a representation of the father, and this comes up for critique in Lacan, in Abraham Torah Derrida, and in Deleuze and Guattari, all of whom read the Wolfman case not through neurosis but through psychosis. They completely turn the table on the reading and read it as a case of psychosis, whereas Freud had clearly read it, that's the title of the Wolfman case, as a case of infantile neurosis. So in that sense, and this is all I need. I need not go into each reading. What it does is that it opens up a line of thinking which later becomes the Lacanian real. And that is where I try to reach real not as inassimilable, not a limit point, not as marking an excess, not a kind of prior or brute materiality, but real as tied to the symbolic order, what Lacan calls the symbolic order. And we'll see why this could become important for Marx, for how we read Marx. And it is with respect to the Wolfman, Lacan inaugurates thinking around a concept and not the way we would generally use it, a concept called foreclosure. A concept called foreclosure, what Lacan called in German primitive Verbe-Funk, and V-E-R-W-E-R-F-U-N-G. So
VR?
W-E-R-F-U-N-G.
Vorwürfe.
So in that sense, this is also a movement. In other words, a movement, and let me read just this little part from Lacan. the Wolfman case was read by Lacan as a fundamental rejection, not as repression. So it's a critique of the repressive hypothesis in psychoanalysis. It's read as a fundamental rejection, and it has always been, for him, quote Lacan, as if the genital plane did not exist. There is no trace of this plane in the symbolic register. Castration, which is how Freud read it, which is precisely what didn't exist for him, because castration requires the presence of the genital plane, at least the presencing of the genital plane. And Lacan is arguing that in Wolfman, the genital plane did not even exist. So you cannot invoke the question of castration or the menacing paternal father, the paternal metaphor, and then the wolf being a representation of that menacing paternal castrating authority. So in that sense, that line of argument, reading Wolfman as infantile neurosis, is for what you need to read a Wolfman. So what Lacan does, he does not even go to that dream. He says that dream is not even important. What is important is a hallucination the Wolfman had, where he felt that he had lost his finger, the little finger, and the little finger hung like a little piece of skin. So there was no finger, it was just the skin of the finger that was present, which comes late in the Wolfman case, a case Freud himself writes, and it comes much later. And this Lacan reads as the most important point. It's not that his finger was cut or scarred, which Freud read as castration. He said the finger was an absence. That plane did not exist. And that is the core of the psychotic hallucination of the case. So in that sense, there is a sort of immediate external world of manifestations perceived in what I will call a primitive real, a non-symbolized real, despite the symbolic form. And this phenomenon Lacan called the psychotic phenomenon, distinguishing it from the neurotic. And this is where the question of the Lacanian real is born. This kind of a primitive real, a non-symbolized real, and in that sense, foreclosure emerging as a concept, as against repression as the foundational or the fundamental concept in psychoanalysis. And I am here reminded of Foucault's critique in History of Sexuality of Psychoanalysis as premised only by the repressive hypothesis, and then Deleuze in Guattari's critique in Anti-Oedipus of psychoanalysis seen as only and only through repression. This little journey is needed because this is what opens up for Lacan a way to rethink the symbolic, and this is where, and this is how I'm reading it, the relationship between Freud and the Lacanian real comes in a way also into being. And that's perhaps the connection between Marxism and Lacan in theory of the subject, where Lacan reads the real as a kind of voiding, of the genital plane in the Wolfman's case history, and that would give a very, very different reading of the Lacanian real, quite different from the way Zizek reads the Lacanian real, largely in Welcome to the Desert of the real as an inassimilable real, the real as eruptive, the real as largely unknown, and the way Badiou reads the real as a twofold, a kind of a twofold between the inassimilable and the foreclosed, and a plane that is a kind of it's not a static void. It is a voiding. So there is a relationship, a tension between the symbolic and the real, which is why the Borromean knot is important. That it's imaginary, symbolic, real in a Borromean knot. It's not one after the other. They cannot exist one without the other. So in that sense, it becomes important. I'm not getting into how Derrida read the Wolfman or how Deleuze read the Wolfman, though it is a little bit important for how I go to Marx, but today we can skip that. Lacan's reading, interestingly, of the Wolfman in turn, and this is what I can't develop too much today, actually to 4 readings of the psychotic phenomenon and 4 readings of the real in Lacan. And Lacan himself moves in a kind of autocorrective, self-corrective gesture. The first move is where the real and the psychotic phenomenon, psychotic thinking, which is not non-thinking, but an other kind of thinking, the psychotic phenomenon or psychotic thinking or psychotic language is understood in terms of or passes in the imaginary identification. And let's not get into it. It's early Lacan in the 1930s. The second is important. Real understood as foreclosure of a fundamental signifier from the symbolic. The genital plane doesn't exist. Which is the 1960s, 1950s Lacan, after the linguistic turn, who is seeing the symbolic order is important and seeing a moment of voiding and the real type to that voiding over there, and that is foreclosure over there. The third phase, where he saw object R and jouissance as marking limits to the symbolic, which is post-1962, and much later Lacan, 1975-76, who went to the logic of the knotting of the imaginary symbolic real in synthons. I'm not working on 1, 3 and 4. I'm leaving them out for today's discussion, though they remain a little important because how he moves in his theory or thinking of the void. What is interesting is that, and this is enough for us, Zizek takes 3. The third meaning of the psychotic phenomenon as very, very serious, reading the real as marking limits to the symbolic, as an eruptive, inassimilable limit. Badiou actually takes 2 and 3 in a way together and tries to stitch or work his way through that. In a way, I'm also partially trying to move in that direction. And now to put it a little telegraphically, then on the one hand see the real, and in that sense the void, can be seen in a twofold way in Lacan. Just to make matters a little simple, on the one hand you have the real, and then there is language, and hence the real will always look like a remainder or an excess or a limit or an inassimilable outside. And that will be there. It will from time to time invite us to the unknown. And that would be one kind of way of looking at the real. The other, what Lacan is marking in the Wolfman case, is that the real is a byproduct. It's not already there. It is not that which is a leftover. So the real understood as either a leftover of the symbolic or the real understood as a byproduct of the symbolic. And this helps us reach Marx in a very different way from the way one would usually reach Marx. So the real as secreted out, as put outside, and the term Lacan uses is repudiated. Repudiated in the operations of the symbolic rather than that which is already there. So what is in the Wolfman's symbolic form that repudiates the genital plane, which he calls foreclosure? So this helps us look at the real. In that sense, the doubt I end up with over here, what is class and what is West and non-capital for Marx? Is class, very interestingly, the inassimilable meaning? It's a thing Marx is not getting at. So there is an undecidable in that sense. At backward when it tries to theorize class. Second, is non-West qua non-capital the foreclosed real of early Marx? So, in that sense, Marx is torn between the two reals, the second meaning and the third meaning. And it's interesting, at least for me, that Badiou sees at least the importance of both meanings. Just a short quote. A gap separates Badiou from the usual Lacanian conception of the real. Since truth concerns the subject's engaged transformation of the real in a local process of fidelity, whereas the usual Lacanian real seems assigned to its immovable resistance to the effects of the symbolic. So it offers a resistance to the symbolic, a resistance one cannot think, one cannot work through, perhaps. Thus to a kind of perpetual inaccessibility from the realm of nomination. This is why the usual associations of the real with horror, brute materiality, mystery, primordial fixity in largely Zizekian's invocations must be dropped from Badiou's ascription of the real. For Badiou, it is this very inaccessibility of the real, the foreclosure, the voiding, which becomes transformed into a possibility for the subject incorporated for or into a truth. So that connection that Badiou would mark between void and subject, with truth, or the real and the subject, with truth, or subject and politics, with truth as the middle term, and I'll come to that, is possible for Badiou because he's not restricted to only that leftover real, the inassimilable real. A real Zizek has to wait for. Let us open up then. Is Marx then trying to work through a notion of class? And which is why chapter 52, and this is a charged phrase for me, what makes class, not what makes class in a historical sense, what makes class as a concept. What would the concept of the class be made of? And in that sense, class not as identity. Class as a kind of, and here I remain a little undecided, class as a kind of historical philosophical individuation. Is class something that has to be or is made? Not made in a passive way, because that would make history makes man. So in that sense, the process, the verb, and where is the void at the core when you think class? And today is not the day for it. I would like to add, I have done actually, that it's non-wage labor is where we cannot usually manage to think labor or surplus labor. And the household is a very interesting moment over there. Woman's non-wage labor. Child's non-wage labor in a tea shop. The bonded non-wage labor. How to think of it within the logic of capital marked by service value, marked by labor, marked as a commodity, labor power marked as a commodity, labor having wage as its accompaniment. So in that sense, how to think large informalizations which are spaces of non-wage labor. So home economy or household economy, non-wage women's labor, etc., etc. So there is something, and this is actually, Marx tries to work on class, but because class is tied to capital tied to wage labor, and because he has worked his way through a labor form, labor as commodity, labor power as commodity, and labor as waged, he's having a little difficulty in chapter 52 thinking through labor, and that is emerging as a moment over here. But the other side of it, and this is not the inassimilable real for me in Lacan, the other side of it is actually a case of voiding. A case of voiding in early Marx, and a voiding to which Marx returns late in life. After volume 3 of Capital, actually. That is where Marx returns, and this is a Marx Progress publishers thought there was no need to publish. Marx between 1863 and 1883, the evening he dies, this entire Marx retained by Progress publishers as not so important. And why would they think this is not so important? This Marx, why he would not get published by Progress publishers. And that needs to be seen. And early Marx writings on British India, where I would argue there is a voiding of the non-West or non-capital in Marx. And in late Marx, Marx works on what I would call an avoiding, not avoiding, an avoiding, a kind of working back through what was voided earlier, and hence foreclosure is important. It's not inassimilable. It was foreclosed in early Marx, in his own theorization, where, to quickly put it, he saw non-capital in India, and that is his writings on British India, non-capital as largely pre-capital, as a prior stage of capital, only to be transcended in the historical or the historical materialist march of capital. Without a critique of history, he cannot begin to see non-capital. Non-capital, or the world called non-capital. Non-capital rendered capital's past, an entity that capital has left behind, a leftover, a kind of a different leftover, not the inassimilable Lacanian leftover, but a different leftover, and hence we would always say, oh, feudal remnants. Okay. Feudality, non-capital, pre-capital as a remnant in our present. And this becomes important when one looks at the contemporary. This section of the paper brings to dialogue two apparently remote and unrelated registers. One, the 19th century Marxian theatre, early Marx to be precise, Marx writing on British India to be specific, where non-capital, that which was not capitalist, was reduced to pre-capital, that which was not yet capitalist, but would soon be, or that which would not manage to be capitalist, that which was a prior stage of capital and hence would either wither away or would need to be transcended, superseded by capital through processes of primitive accumulation. In mainstream development discourse, one calls it displacement. Primitive accumulation was no doubt violence, but it was necessary, hence justified. Necessary to break pre-capitalist remnants and fetters, justified in terms of the unleashing of the hidden forces of capital. And two, and I'm taking a huge leap over here, the world of the Adivasi, the contemporary Adivasi, reduced to what one would call the tombstone of the illicit. What is a tombstone of the illicit? An Adivasi world rendered the tombstone of the illicit. Why illicit? Why tombstone? What is it? In liberal and radical discourses, in conservative and progressive discourses, in disciplinary and emancipatory discourses, in nationalist and unfortunately even in Marxist discourses. As Mashwata Devi has argued, both remaining complicit in the destruction of the world of the Adivasi. The world of the Adivasi as an economic illicit, a pre-capitalist tombstone in times of spectacular forms of capital-centric development. As a historical illicit which has to retire into the nation's prehistory or the history of pre-capital, the world of the Adivasi is as if a split pathological part of an otherwise confident India, a part that will now be relegated to the realm of the past and transformed into the tombstone of museumized artifacts. That is the attack on Basti. As a political illicit, as gravel in the shoe of the Indian state when the Adivasi resist mining, land acquisition, primitive agriculture. Tagged as the lagging other of capital and modernity, targeted as backward and superstitious, the Adivasi emerges as the figure of the terminally ill, a kind of historical inevitability of slow demise has as if been tattooed on her body being. The Adivasi also the target of a double death sentence. On the one hand, endless territorial displacement through developmental projects since independence and everyday dislocation of the forms of habitat through the expansion of the logic of capital. And on the other, what I would call psychoanalytic displacement, marked by the new brown Orientalist equation of modern confident India. Tribal India today is what we were yesterday, and hence non-capitalist pre-capital. And their tomorrow is nothing other than what we are today. It is as if the epitaph of the Adivasi as the living dead, is always already written. The paper argues that the part of the script for such an epitaph was written how early Marx had conceptualized non-capital. Non-capital as pre-capital. The Orientalist history of non-capital. History reduced to historical materialism in which early Marx sees non-capital as pre-capital and hence renders it the tombstone of the illicit. Interestingly, the voiding that Marx initiates, writings on British India that Edward Said critiques and Aizaz Ahmed wrongly defends. It's a tragic defense of Marx. There is, however, a counterscript to Marx in late Marx. Marx between 1863 and 1883, where there is an avoiding, if I may put it that way, not an avoiding. The avoiding was what Progress Publishers did, when Marx returns to non-capital in a completely new way. Learning from Russia/Asia. Not learning from British political economy, French political theory, and German idealist philosophy. Not those three. Not the three sources and component parts which Lenin spoke of. So in that sense, the need to read an Asiatic in Marx. The need to read an Asiatic Marx. And this counterscript is where one sees the two histories of non-capital, not the two histories of capital, which worries Divesh Chakraborty. And in that sense, it is how we can look at ourselves. And I'm just not using in a bad sense, using the Adivasi to make the question explicit, actually. The Adivasi world could be seen as part or a prior stage in India's continuing march to national modernity. The same could also be seen as not easily assailable, and on the other hand, as that which is voided by us in our self-definition, and that is what becomes important. This last part, I'll quickly go through it, 5 more minutes, where Marx actually, let me not read this part completely, what I call the two genealogies of aboriginalization. One, where you render a world aboriginal, and 2, where you render your own world aboriginal. You question your own original premises, and in that sense there is as if both in Marx. On the one hand, what I can call an aboriginalization of the other world, but on the other hand, a rethinking of his own premised on that which was voided, and a return to it. And late Marx being brave enough to put under erasure the Western European originals. Marx marking a genealogy of aboriginalization other than the colonial anthropology. That's not the Marx. So in that sense, this is late Marx, and just let me summarize it in one sentence and not get into the real antecedents over here. What happens in late Marx post 1863 is Marx is faced with writings from Russia, people who hadn't read Marx. Primarily a person called Chernyshevsky, who actually wrote his, quote-unquote, his capital. And it comes through Marx, through Danielson. And Marx is puzzled by it. And he starts learning Russian. And he learns Russian painstakingly. And my friends who know Russian say it's a very difficult language to learn. And in that sense, with a lot of difficulty, he starts reading these Russian texts and starts revisiting his earlier text. There are many texts. One core text, and I owe it to Partha Chatterjee actually, when I was an MPhil student at CSSC, it was he who showed me this text. As a young Marxist activist, it was a shock to see that text, a text called Ethnological Notebooks of Marx, in which there is a chapter on Bengal, a village in Bengal, where Marx is trying to rethink would non-Europe, the non-West, follow, in one line, the historical trajectory Europe has followed? Or would non-West, which is the pre-capital capital trajectory, or would non-West follow a trajectory, hen non-capital, follow a trajectory other than the standard trajectory that had been set for Europe, or Western Europe, not even Turkey, Western Europe. And this is a huge manuscript Marx goes through. Theodor Schanin says it's about 30,000 pages of handwritten manuscript, which Progress Publishers did not publish. And there is a note in the Progress Publishers archive. The note says Marx had gone a little demented, a little mad, a little psychotic, a little bit of non-thinking. What is he doing? And this is the phase Marx doesn't publish. It's unpublished manuscripts, which would be coming now through Mega, and Amsterdam University has preserved it, so we would be able to read it. But Etymological Notebooks is in English. That's the only part of these 30,000 pages that I have managed to read. There is, of course, a very interesting manuscript which has come in English already. It's 1,012 pages, mathematical manuscript. Marx writing on algebra. So he's making the connection actually over here, which Pradeep Bakshi has translated from Russian into English, and it's available, not that I understand it, but I can make sense of it. There is something over there. But it's etymological notebooks on which I premise my other Marx over here, and avoiding in Marx, where Marx moves over here to what, quickly put, let me not spend too much time on it, just one line from Chernyshevsky, which Marx quotes and translates into English. He starts translating Chernyshevsky into his language. history is like a grandmother. It loves the younger grandchildren. To the latecomers, that is Russia/Asia, it gives not the bones, but the marrow of the bones. While Western Europe has hurt her fingers badly in her attempts to break the bones and walk its way through capitalism. So he's trying to say the others may find other roots, and this produces an originally multiplicity at the core of history. But an originally multiplicity you cannot own up to as long as there is that primitive foreclosure. There is that voiding of non-capital into capital. And a voiding or a rendering of labor tied to labor as commodity, labor power as commodity, labor as wage labor. How to think labor beyond wage labor. And this is when Marx also gets into studies of landed property. If you look at the Marx archive Marx creates over here, it's India, it's Portugal, it's Latin America, it's Algeria, and it's Russia. It's completely something other than Britain, France, Germany, which we think are the three component parts of Marx. Let me end with 2 points, actually. What is it to think the world? I don't have the time anymore, but quickly put, this part of the paper actually tries to go into the 4 readings of the world in Heidegger, in the section on the world. And the world as an ontic concept, the world rendered entity, the world as an ontological concept, the world as marked essentially, not as beings essentially, unlike Dasein that can be encountered within the world, but rather as that in which in Heidegger, a factical Dasein lives, a kind of what he calls pre-ontological existential meaning, not existentialist. And then the 4th meaning of the world, worldliness, page 65-64 of Being and Time. And Heidegger sticks to the 3rd meaning of the world. In that sense, the need to move beyond 3rd world, which renders our world an entity, to an understanding of the world. Can we think of a world of the 3rd? A world beyond the world circumscribed by the capital, pre-capital logic. Because pre-capital is not the 2nd world. It is the lacking 1st world. It is the lagging 1st world. Only to be transcended, only to be superseded. So in that sense, what is to see ourselves as the world of the 3rd rather than as 3rd world, which renders us an entity within the womb of the capital, pre-capital logic, which is a logic of what I would put it, logic of P not P. So there are no 2, there is 1 in that sense. The last part on the subject. What would happen then if one now thinks the subject, or subject and the political together? Because one has to think Marx now in terms of class as the inassimilable real, that void, and non-capital, which could be post-capital. That's Chernyshevsky, the ground for post-capital. Okay. A post-capital futurity, a future to come, in terms of the foreclosed real and the need for an avoiding. In other words, it's interesting the way Shonda put it in the morning, that I can only think identity in terms of the void and cannot avoid it and think identity. So what is it to think from there? Think the political from there. And let me just, for want of time, read this part. Badiou Meditation 35, Theory of the Subject, can be instructive to imagine a post-Cartesian doctrine of the Marxian subject. A subject is not a substance. A subject is not a void point either. A subject is not in any manner the organization of a sense of experience. Every subject is rigorously singular. A subject is not a result any more than it is an origin. It is the local configuration of a generic procedure, a configuration in excess of the situation from which a truth is supported. So that's the subject-truth connection. Badiou offers a somewhat thin understanding of the subject, not just a revolutionary subject, but a subject nevertheless as local configuration. Configuration in excess of a situation and locus of a truth. He suggests that perhaps there could be no more than two forms of the subject, one political and the other psychoanalytical, whose topology, he says, we owe to Marx and Freud. Hence the need to go back to the Althusser-Lacan correspondence. Think the subject from the moment of foreclosure. Think the subject from that moment of voiding and the avoiding. Can we think the subject there? Badiou says something crazy. Every subject is political, which is why there are few subjects and rarely any politics. What does Badiou mean by every subject is political? Of course, he does not mean every subject, each and every subject is political. He means perhaps the political is the condition of the subject in excess of human animals that we are otherwise in our daily procreation. The political sutures the subject. Badiou develops this further in conditions. Every subject is induced by a generic procedure and thus depends on an event, which I don't fully understand yet, the event. Which is why the subject, not existence or individuality, is rare. Badiou therefore connects or brings to co-implication subject and truth. For him, a theory of the subject at the farthest remove from any purely experiential or moral account is always the theory of the formal conditions for the emergence of a universalizable, not universal, truth. Badiou takes care of the possible tautology of subject and the political when he says every subject is political. The political sutures the subject sutures the political. So the invocation of a third truth. I am approaching it through the invocation of the foreclosed real, the void end. Is there the possibility of a subject? And does Marx see that as he turns Asiatic or Russian? And this opens up a question for us. Badiou brings the canonical teachings of Althusser into dialogue with Lacan. Badiou calls it, quote, beautiful line, unexpected help from Lacan for Marxism. But the project cannot be completed without the very concept of the subject that classical materialism, a materialism Marx critiques in the first of the 11 theses of Feuerbach, had previously debunked as sheer idealist humbug. Marxism for Badiou is the discourse with which the proletariat sustains itself as a subject. Hence, what makes class rather than what is class. Badiou does not wish to let go of the idea, but how to retain the idea in a post-Cartesian form is the question. Once again, there is unexpected help from Lacan. In Seminar 14 on the logic of fantasy, Lacan moves from accepting Heidegger's critique of the Cartesian cogito to the paradoxical and counterintuitive embrace of the cogito, but cogito this time as the subject of the real, the subject tied to the void and the avoided, the subject birthed at that moment. The Lacanian subject is thus the subject of the real and is not necessarily, essentially, the really real subject. it's not the working class. It is as if Lacan first accepts Heidegger's point that the Cartesian cogito inaugurates the forgetting of being, but then he returns to the argument that the subject is the question where the cogito is tied, and he goes into it, that it's the cutting wheel in which the real breaks through. Etc. Let me not get into that. But what he manages to do over here is to show that the subject is paradoxically in that gap, in that void. The gap of the real as the foremost. Lacan thus moves to it, the real things. Therefore, I am subject, I am political. Given that the subject is where the political is, and the political is where the subject is, what this would do to the question of the subject or the political is an open question for me, if you have to think from here. But I do not remain too much of a destitute in destitute times. Primarily because if we, the left, have to refine ourselves, perhaps we need to move to a politics around the void. In times when there looks to be some kind of a void in politics.